Good afternoon. Right now, millions of Canadians from coast to coast don't have the option to do their job from home. They have to show up for work. Yet the Liberal NDP coalition are asking for special treatment and accommodation that the average Canadian doesn't have access to. Ils veulent éviter de se rendre au travail pendant que des millions de Canadiens n'ont pas le choix. L'arrogance des libéraux et de NPD est alarmante et l'hypocrisie de ce gouvernement est surprenant et décevant. Hypocrisy, like organizing crowds and rallies, breaking health rules, and campaigning in hospitals just weeks ago when it suited the Liberals. Gathering with thousands of people in the same room in Glasgow just days ago when it suited them. Drinking and posing for the cameras with dozens of world leaders when it suited them. Ils ont même brisé les règles sanitaires pendant la campagne électorale. But today, shutting down debate and limiting democratic accountability because it bothers them. 2 months ago, Conservative MPs were elected from British Columbia to Newfoundland and Labrador to represent Canadians who are increasingly being left behind by Justin Trudeau and this Liberal government. Canadians asked us to stand up for them, and that is what we will do. We will be here for you. We will give voice to energy workers and auto workers who have a prime minister that has failed them time and time again with respect to trade in the United States. La voix des propriétaires de PME et des agriculteurs qui luttent pour se remettre sur pied après la pandémie. We will be the voice of families with children and seniors on fixed income who are struggling with the skyrocketing price of essentials like gas and groceries. To hold the government to account as Canadians expect, we must be here in Ottawa working for Canadians. That's why Canada's Conservatives do not support the Liberal plan to return to virtual Parliament, and why Canadians should be asking why the Liberals can gather in Glasgow but are out of sight in Ottawa. C'est donc pourquoi les conservateurs du Canada ne soutiennent pas le plan libéral pour maintenir un Parlement virtuel. C'est pourquoi les Canadiens devraient poser la question au Premier ministre. Pourquoi les grands rassemblements à Glasgow, mais ici au Canada, les sièges sont vides au Parlement? Why is the Prime Minister being such a hypocrite? What are the Liberals afraid of? The answer is obvious. Justin Trudeau has an aversion to accountability. They have no plan to fight inflation, and they need to cover up their ethical misconduct. A virtual Parliament will limit the voice of Canadians. It will limit your voice, and we can't sacrifice that in our democracy. Before the election, Liberal ministers would happily come to Ottawa for press conferences, but now they refuse to show up in the House of Commons for their constituents. Millions of hardworking Canadians don't have the option of not showing up for work tomorrow, and neither should this government. The NDP is not on the side of Canadians on this issue. Instead, they are joining the Liberals in the coalition of the unwilling to be accountable, unwilling to get back to work. Conservatives are the only national party that is fighting to protect our democracy. The only party standing up against the hypocrisy of the Liberals and the NDP. Canadians can be assured that every single day we will hold this coalition of the unwilling to account. We will ask the tough question on why Glasgow was fine for Justin Trudeau and Ottawa was not. I'll now take questions from the media, who I hope will ask this question as well. The history of the press gallery covering debates and accountability in Parliament is as important, as core, and as old as our democracy itself. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
I'll go first if you don't mind, Mr. O'Toole. Mike Lecouture with Global News. A Global News investigation has found that your party spent $1 million to set up and run the Ottawa election studio. Around that same time, your office billed taxpayers for $74,000 in communications and broadcasting equipment. So I wanted to know, can you assure Canadians that no public money went into that election studio?
Yes, I can assure Canadians that no money was used, public money, in the election cycle. As a leader elected in a pandemic, we had to be ready for a pandemic election. We knew that Justin Trudeau would use the pandemic for his political favor, and the studio was a way that we could connect with hundreds of thousands of people, and we continued to use it through our party resources during the election.
This is a follow-up, given all the money that went into it, how much time you spent in it, and the election result. Do you really think that the party got good value for that money that you spent?
Yes, we had to be ready, and the military guy in me wanted to make sure we were ready even under the most challenging circumstances of a full virtual election. We were the only party that consistently followed public health guidance throughout the campaign. That was not Mr. Trudeau's example. And in fact, the fact that he broke rules in the campaign when it suited him and now is trying to shut down Parliament when there's tough questions to be answered, that should show he's in it for himself and not for the well-being of Canadians.
Hi, Mr. O'Toole. Tom Parry with CBC. There's video out now of the RCMP going into a protest camp out in BC in Wet'suwet'en Territory. I'm wondering if you've seen that video, if you have, what you think about it. If you've not seen it, what in general do you think about the RCMP going in and clearing that camp?
Well, nobody wants to see when blockades and law-breaking get to a point that authorities and police need to be involved. I asked the Prime Minister yesterday about economic reconciliation with Indigenous Canadians. There are 20 benefit agreements signed with respect to that project. And blockades like this and a culture that we've seen with Mr. Suzuki's comments suggesting acts of vandalism or even terrorism if this type of protest culture doesn't get its way cannot be ignored. The fact that Mr. Trudeau has done nothing to criticize these comments is very, very troubling. And so what we have to do is have the rule of law. There's not a special set of rules for protesters or blockaders.
The last time this dispute flared up, there were blockades in other parts of the country. There were protests across the country. Are you concerned about that happening again? And what more do you think the federal government should be doing to make sure that doesn't happen?
We need to have a rule of law for everyone, of all backgrounds. And what increasingly the protest culture that's supported by Justin Trudeau and Jagmeet Singh, that is holding back Indigenous peoples more than anyone else. Every time Mr. Trudeau cancels a project or doesn't act when there's blockades across the country, that hurts First Nation communities with benefit agreements. That hurts royalty revenues that could help lift communities and Indigenous peoples out of poverty. So one of my first questions yesterday was on economic reconciliation. It's time to make sure that the next intergenerational transfer for Indigenous peoples is wealth and opportunity and not trauma, and Conservatives will fight for that.
Bonjour, Monsieur O'Toole. Sur le Parlement hybride, il y a déjà le Bloc québécois qui dit que tous ses députés, même si c'est hybride, vont être en personne à la Chambre des communes. Est-ce que ça va être le cas aussi pour votre caucus? Est-ce que tout le monde va être en Chambre, même si c'est hybride?
Absolument. Tous nos députés vont être ici dans la Chambre pour notre travail, pour la transparence, pour notre démocratie. C'est totalement inacceptable pour M. Trudeau d'avoir les grands rassemblements, les réunions à Glasgow, mais pas les réunions ici, sur la colline. C'est un autre exemple d'un gouvernement totalement déconnecté par les besoins des Canadiens et totalement ciblé sur leurs petits intérêts.
Et je voulais revenir sur le cas de votre député Dean Allison qui dit qu'il a une exemption médicale. Comment pouvez-vous expliquer qu'il n'est pas en isolement en ce moment après avoir été possiblement en contact avec Richard Lehoux la semaine dernière?
Comme vous le savez, j'ai dit il y a 6 mois, on doit suivre les règles et on doit utiliser tous les outils nécessaires dans notre lutte contre la COVID-19. Les vaccins, la distanciation sociale, les masques et toutes les mesures. On a fait ça. Nous sommes le seul parti qui ont fait ça pendant la campagne électorale. Et c'était le cas avec M. Leroux. On a suivi toutes les règles sanitaires et heureusement, M. Leroux était vacciné et il est en train d'être en bonne forme maintenant.
Oui, bonjour, M. O'Toole, Laurence Martin de Radio-Canada. On attend cet après-midi le rapport du commissaire à l'environnement. Bon, le rapport n'est pas encore public, mais on sait déjà que le Canada est encore loin d'atteindre ses cibles climatiques. Je me demandais, est-ce que vous pensez que les conservateurs ont une part de responsabilité là-dedans? Puis je pense entre autres à votre opposition pendant des années à un prix sur le carbone et même à, je dirais peut-être à une diabolisation de la taxe sur le carbone.
Comme vous le savez, Laurence, en avril, j'ai lancé notre plateforme sur l'environnement et le changement climatique. On a utilisé un prix sur le carbone. On a proposé des mesures concrètes en ce qui concerne l'environnement. C'est une priorité d'avoir une approche réelle et ciblée sur une réduction des émissions de gaz à effet de serre et une relance économique. Mais comme j'ai dit dans la campagne, M. Trudeau a dit des belles paroles, mais sans action concrète sur les émissions. Et ça serait le cas avec une augmentation de son taxe.
Mais ma question, ce n'est pas quel est votre plan maintenant, c'est est-ce que vous pensez que les conservateurs dans les dernières années, puis je pense entre autres aux années Harper, parce que vous avez fait partie de ce gouvernement-là, est-ce que vous pensez que les conservateurs ont suffisamment agi quand ils étaient au pouvoir pour lutter contre les changements climatiques?
Après 6 ans de M. Trudeau est responsable pour la situation. Pas M. Harper, pas un ancien gouvernement, c'est M. Trudeau. Et comme d'habitude, des belles paroles sans un plan d'action. C'est la même chose avec l'environnement, la réconciliation. Et maintenant, il y a une crise d'inflation et zéro plan d'action sur ça. C'est pourquoi les conservateurs, on va être ici pour agir pour les Canadiens.
Greg Quinn, Market News International. Mr. O'Toole, there's been a lot of focus on inflation, the rising cost of living harming households lately. The government has argued this is a global phenomenon, not something particularly Canadian. I'm wondering what Parliament writ large can do to help with the rising inflation we're seeing.
Well, this is a global phenomenon, but the big difference with Mr. Trudeau is our economy is not growing. We have one of the highest inflation rates in the world. We spent more per capita than any of our peer countries, and we have the worst results in terms of employment, in terms of inflation. And the cost of living crisis is real. Wages are only barely moving, and inflation is almost 5%. So people are being priced out of their own lives. I was in Victoria a week ago. In just the last year, rent's up 20%. Food banks are saying most of their users now are renters, and a large rise of families renting with children. There needs to be a sense of urgency here, but instead, Mr. Trudeau is going back to his hibernation, hiding from accountability, and I think we're gonna fight for that. And I hope Canadians ask why he can go and be in a room with thousands of people, no vaccine passports in Glasgow for those meetings, but he can't be around a few dozen people here. It's hypocrisy of the highest order, and I think people are tired of a government that's always hiding.
One of the most difficult aspects is the cost of housing, especially in big cities. Many experts now believe that it's a supply problem at the local and provincial level. I'm wondering if, for example, you could reach out to your Conservative allies at the local and provincial level and press them to let the free market build more houses.
I have, and I'm glad to see in Ontario, for example, they are trying to do tying density and growth to investments in transportation and transit. That was in our platform, accelerate federal infrastructure dollars for those large transit projects if we can see acceleration of supply. We had a very dynamic set of housing proposals that was going to help new home buyers. It was going to help with supply. It was going to get funds out the door. It had a for Indigenous, by Indigenous policy. I'd invite Canadians that want real solutions, that are tired of the empty rhetoric of Mr. Trudeau, big ambition, zero achievement, to give the Conservatives a look. And I think housing is one example. Housing was already a crisis after 5 years of Mr. Trudeau. Pile on top of that gas, groceries, everyday essentials. People are getting priced out of their lives. Mr. Trudeau doesn't even seem to know it's happening. So we're going to fight for those Canadians here in Parliament.
This will be the last question. How about accountability?
What happened to accountability?
Yeah,
That's not cool.
Press gallery. Yeah.
Stephanie Taylor with the Canadian Press. I echo what my colleagues are saying. You say you are pro-choice. So what do you think of the Liberal plan to revoke charitable status for anti-abortion organizations, crisis pregnancy centers? Should these centers continue to have charitable status? The Liberals doing the right thing? What's your position?
Well, I'm pro-choice, and I've said that. I try and respect decisions women make with respect to their own bodies. I've tried to also be respectful of personal health decisions, and in the pandemic, always tried to make sure that I didn't politicize health issues. The very fact you mentioned crisis centers, should we politicize anything where people are going if they're in crisis? The Liberals seem to think that's a good idea, and they're winning elections by dividing the country. They think it's efficient to divide people. In fact, Mr. Trudeau's top advisor thinks it's great they're becoming efficient by dividing up people, turning people against one another, and that's not our approach. So if anyone is at crisis, for any reason, whether it's addiction, homelessness, an issue related to choice for a woman, we need to bring people together, not divide them. And that's what Conservatives will try and do.
You didn't answer the question, but I'm going to move on. You talk about Mr. Trudeau needing to face accountability. There are Conservative members that want you to face accountability within the next 6 months. So why won't you ask the party president, the National Council, to expedite that leadership review? You're leader of the party, after all. Surely something can be accommodated. So why won't you make that move?
Well, I'm happy to say, Stephanie, and I'm sure you know this, that with the Reform Act, I've given my caucus the tools to make sure that I'm accountable to my caucus and to our party. We have a mechanism underway right now being run by James Cumming on a 360 review. It will be the first and most comprehensive that is shared with our party and with our National Council. We also have a party process underway right now. So I'll be the most accountable any leader has been in the history of our country. But what I'm not going to allow to happen is for Mr. Trudeau not to be accountable. In fact, today, the vote tonight is about him not being accountable to Canadians for the next 6 to 8 months. As I said, he'll go to meetings, he'll hold elections. I just left chamber where Liberals are hugging and having fun. There's no need for him to go to a hybrid session. It's irresponsible. It's the height of hypocrisy. So I want Canadians to know there'll be one national party here for you fighting inflation, and that will be the Conservative Party of Canada. Thank you very much.
Monsieur O'Toole,